and I love Advent. Advent always begins what feels for me like a magical time of year. And I think that goes back to my childhood and what it represented for me as a kid. It represented time off school. It represented, still represents time off school for me. It represented toys, which I didn't have that many toys as a kid. So getting some brand new toys, and usually there was one big toy that I was really excited about. And for at least several days after Christmas, it was still exciting because it was new enough. And there was food, sweet food. There was stuffing, bread stuffing that I loved even as a kid. There was time with family. My parents were divorced for most of my childhood, and I lived with my father, visited my mother every other weekend, and so Christmas also meant being able to go to my mother's place and spend a week or so with her. And so in all of these different ways, Christmas represented for me this almost perfect time of peace, of happiness, of really not having to worry about anything, really not having anything to be afraid of. And for me growing up, that was a kind of oasis of peace in the middle of the rest of the year that I often found really difficult, even as a kid. I often didn't have that many friends at school and found myself on the outside looking in, wondering, what am I doing wrong? Why don't they like me? I often got home and felt at home like I was somehow never getting things right, somehow never good enough. And found myself from quite a young age often feeling depressed, even though I didn't have that language for it at the time. And so around this time of year, I would start to anticipate hearing the Christmas music, having Christmas crafts at school and everything else, start to anticipate that little window of something that felt peaceful and joyful and good just for a few days in the year. Often now that I'm an adult, I've wondered how to connect that sense of magical Christmas peace with what we do here at church, with my faith in Jesus, because often they seem pretty divorced, don't they? We watch Christmas movies on TV, or we hear Christmas music on the radio, and everybody has this sort of Christmassy feeling, but for many people it has nothing to do with Jesus. And sometimes in my own life it has felt kind of separate from my faith. There's all of that magical excitement, and then there's the Jesus stuff, and I'm not quite sure how they come together. And I think looking at a passage like our reading from Jeremiah today helps us to begin to understand how these things fit together. Because Jeremiah was definitely in a bleak season, even more bleak than my experience growing up, certainly. Jeremiah had, as we heard earlier, lived to see Jerusalem destroyed. And he and the other upper-class rulers of Jerusalem had been tied up, chained up, and carried off to Babylon, and the whole urban class of Jerusalem were living in exile, the ones that hadn't been killed in the siege of the city. And to understand what that meant and why that was such a shattering experience for them, we have to go back and think about how Israel understood themselves at the time. So in Israel's own understanding, they had been created by God for a purpose. God had, back in the book of Genesis, looked at the world and seen that things weren't the way they were supposed to be. There was violence, there was poverty and injustice, there was hatred, and God's relationship with people was broken so that they weren't worshiping him, they were worshiping idols. And God wanted to restore and heal the world. And to do that, he didn't choose one group or one people above others. He chose Abraham, one man, and created a new people out of Abraham so that he wouldn't be playing favorites. And that new people grew into Israel. And they suffered slavery in Egypt, but God brought them out in the Exodus and planted them in a promised land, in their own land, so that they could be like a laboratory where God would teach them what life was supposed to look like. They would learn to live justly. They would learn to live in compassion instead of hatred. They would learn to live so that judges didn't accept bribes, and so that there wasn't a massive imbalance between rich and poor, and everyone had what they need and were protected when a woman was widowed or when a child was left orphaned. People would take care of the people who needed care. And in all of these ways, they would live out, not just in the temple, but in all of their life, worship of God. They would live as humanity was meant to live in the first place. And initially they did okay, but very quickly Israel in the land discovered that they were as much the problem as they were the solution. And all of the things that was broken about humanity general showed up in Israel themselves. And there was injustice, and there was poverty and gross wealth in the face of that poverty. And judges accepted bribes, and children were left to starve, and widows were left to starve, and people worshiped other gods. And over again, God tried to bring the people back to himself, back to being that laboratory of a restored world. And over again, they stumbled and failed at it. And so God brought them a king, David, who was a man that was humble and who really had pure, just motivations, who was devoted at the bottom of himself to being the kind of ruler that Israel needed, not to his own self-interest. And for a while, again, David was able to be that king that they needed, and he helped the people to be much more the people that they were supposed to be. But even David himself discovered his own inner corruption and stumbled toward the end of his life. And certainly under Solomon, his son, who was a very mixed individual, we saw both the heights of what humanity was capable of and the depths of the corruption that they're capable of. And by the time we get to the 6th century BC, when Jeremiah is writing, the people had descended in this downward spiral to the point where other gods were being worshipped openly in the temple in Jerusalem. 10 of the tribes had been completely wiped out by the Assyrians. Babylon had finally come and laid siege to Jerusalem, burning and slaughtering the villages around the holy city, and Jerusalem itself had fallen to the Babylonian army. Now, the upper class of Jerusalem, the people who were supposed to be that guidance for the nation, had been deported. And for all intents and purposes, Israel was done. The laboratory was closed. That left Jeremiah and the other Judean exiles sitting in Babylon wondering, what next? Is that it? Is it over? Has evil won? Has injustice won? If we weren't able to be the instrument of God's work to restore the world, what hope is there for the world? Let alone there being no hope for us. It's over. That's what it seemed like. Until God's message came to Jeremiah the prophet. And he said to the people, it's not over. Even though it looks like it's over, and even though we have completely messed up, and even though it seems like there's no going back and there's no making right everything that's gone wrong, it's not over. Even though the line of kings has come to an end, somehow God is going to bring a new shoot from the line of Jesse. Jesse, of course, was David's father. In other words, a new king who's a descendant of David, who's like David in his purity and in his justice, who in fact is even greater than David because he's not going to mess up even in the ways that David did. He's going to come back, and under his leadership, God's going to make us the people that we have never been able to be. And implicit in that promise is the promise that finally Israel's role in the world will be fulfilled too. It's not just that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. It's not just that the promised land will see the people finally living the way they were meant to live. It's also that God, through them, will bless the whole world. And the whole earth and all of human society will be restored. To Jeremiah, that must have seemed like a magical vision of the future. Every bit as magical as Christmas seemed to me when I was sitting in October wondering when my school day would end so I could just get home and put my head under the covers and bury myself in a book. That day when God's promises would be fulfilled must have seemed like an impossibly peaceful, impossibly perfect time. And yet, Jeremiah is saying, wait for it because it's coming. Anticipate it. Hope for it. Look forward to it. Live now as if you're positive that it's going to happen. And somehow, just like the joy and peace of Christmas Day kind of bleeds back into Advent, and we already start feeling that magical sense of peace and joy, even in the weeks leading up to it. For Israel, too, that anticipation, that living in hope, would mean that they already would begin to experience some of the peace and joy of that final restoration. Even in exile, even as they're waiting for it to happen. For us today, 2,500 years and more after Jeremiah was speaking, Advent gives us a chance to celebrate the fact that Jeremiah was right. The king did come back to Israel in the person of Jesus. A king even greater and more perfect and more just than David ever was. And Jeremiah was also right in his vision of what that king would begin to put right, would begin to change. Because Jesus did come and didn't just die on the cross for our sins, but also taught people a different way of living. Taught people a different way of treating each other. And that teaching of Jesus has already, over 20 centuries, changed human society all around the world. We often don't appreciate this. But when we look at our society now and the fact that we don't have to live in fear of violence in most of our daily life, the fact that women increasingly don't have to live in the kind of fear and domination of the men in their lives that they have had to for generations. The fact that in many parts of the world, people are finally beginning to enjoy safe drinking water. The fact that there are actually functioning court systems in many parts of the world, including Canada, where we can actually have cases heard without fear that the rich person is just going to get their way because they bribed the judge. In all kinds of ways, the teaching of Jesus has changed the world. And we're already beginning to see that not just in our own forgiveness by God, not just in our own reconciliation in our personal relationships with God, but also in society and in the world on the whole, some of what Jeremiah looked forward to seeing, the world being put right under a just and righteous and perfect king, some of that is already a reality. And whether we're thinking about our own personal relationships with God or whether we're thinking about everything that we've been able to come to enjoy as a society, Advent gives us a chance to say, yes, God, thank you for not leaving us alone. Thank you for not making us wait forever. And we can have a deepened appreciation for everything God's already done for us by going back in Advent and remembering how agonizing the wait was for Jeremiah, for the Judeans. Remembering what it must have been like to say, God, how long do we have to wait here in Babylon? And that makes us even more deeply grateful that Jesus has come and Jesus has begun to change everything. At the same time, in the New Testament reading in Luke 21, we're reminded that even on the eve of Jesus' own death and resurrection, he recognized that not all of it had happened yet. He had come. He was Messiah, Israel's expected king. But that didn't mean that his reign had been completed yet. In fact, things were about to get a lot worse for his disciples. And in that set of prophecies that Jesus offers in Luke chapter 21, he says essentially, yeah, it's bad right now and it's going to get worse. There are going to be times when you have to flee violence. There are going to be times when you still suffer. There are going to be times when you still see injustice, when it looks like evil's winning, when it looks like the worship of God is disappearing from the world. And what he said to them is, just like Jeremiah was told, hang on and hope, you too need to hang on and hope. Because just when it looks like it's most impossible, just like it looks when it's like it's never going to happen, God is going to bring the final fulfillment of his kingdom, the final fulfillment of the Messiah's reign over the world. And the glimpses and the hints and the partial fulfillments that we see now are going to be eclipsed by the complete restoration of God's cosmos. A new heavens and a new earth that transform the old so that all things worship God, so that we are all reconciled in our relationship with God, and evil is finally removed from the world, and a different kind of life becomes possible. It's coming. And just when it looks like it's most impossible, that's when Jesus says we need to recognize the signs that have already happened as the proof, as the evidence that it's yet to come. So at Advent, when we feel that anticipation for Christmas Day, we're not just celebrating what's already happened by remembering how agonizing the wait was for Jeremiah. We're also recognizing the painful reality of our world today. The fact that for all the things that have changed, we're still broken people. Our society is still a broken society. Our relationships with God are still broken. There are still many places and many ways in which life now is worse than it was when Jesus first came. And it would be easy for us to give up hope and say it's pointless. It's pointless to stay faithful to God. It's pointless to try to make the world a better place. It's pointless to tell people about Jesus. And at Advent, we're reminded that it's not pointless. Because as dark as it may seem, as painful as my life may be right now, as impossible as things might seem, Jesus has told us that it would be like this, and that the best is yet to come. And so at Advent, we not only celebrate what Jesus has already done, we not only celebrate the fact that the promises have been fulfilled in part and that the King has come, but we also are reminded to live in hope all year round. To live in that same anticipation that the final Christmas, the final holiday, when all things will be put right again, is going to happen. It's not going to be in 4 weeks from now. I don't know when it's going to be, but it's not going to be in 4 weeks from now, probably. But when we sit down and enjoy our turkey or ham or stuffing, when we open presents together, when we are with family, whatever joy we find in that, we can anticipate that as just a foretaste of the final joy, the final peace, the final beautiful, magical season we will get to enjoy in the resurrection when all things are put right. So when you do come together, when you open presents this Christmas, whether it's a time that feels magical and joyful, or whether it's a time that feels painful and lonely, I hope that you will be able to live through that moment in hope. Take whatever joy, whatever peace, whatever magical moments you're able to have together with whatever people you celebrate with, and take those as a foretaste of what Messiah came to do. And take them as a sign that you can hope for so much more. And as a person living in hope, as you get together at Christmas and as we anticipate in Advent, let's look for those ways in which we can make our hope practical by trying to make somebody else's Advent and somebody else's Christmas a little bit more like that perfect Christmas that we have in our imagination. Is there somebody that we can invite to get together with? Is there somebody whose gift we can make especially special or poignant or life-changing? Is there something that we can give of our time to make somebody's Christmas different? Let's look for those ways in which we can take the hope of Advent, the fulfilled hope of Jeremiah, and the hope that we still live in anticipating the resurrection, and bring that hope more tangibly into somebody else's life. Amen.